Not everyone can afford a $5,000 luxury penthouse. My brother's voice echoed through the sprawling, glass-walled dining room, dripping with an arrogant pity that made the blood in my veins run freezing cold. The words hung in the air for a fraction of a second before the entire room erupted. Everyone laughed, my cousin snickering so loudly that he nearly spilled his expensive wine. But the worst part, the visual that burned itself into my retinas and truly solidified my rage, was seeing my own parents smile. It was a warm, indulgent smile, as if my public humiliation was just a harmless, charming family joke. I sat there in my plain gray suit, staring at the cheap housewarming gift I had intentionally brought, feeling a familiar, toxic anger claw at my throat. For 29 years, I had been the invisible shadow, the punching bag, the quiet accountant who swallowed every insult to keep the peace. They thought I was a failure living in a tiny box. They thought I was drowning in mediocrity. But what they did not know was that the very building my brother was using to prove his worth was about to become the stage for my ultimate revenge. How did we get here? And how did one single night shatter my family dynamic forever? Let me take you back to where this nightmare truly began, to the roots of the tree of resentment that had been growing in our family for decades. I am Declan, 29 years old, and I work as a corporate financial auditor. By nature and by profession, I am a man of logic, numbers, and cold, hard facts. I do not deal in illusions, fantasies, or the desperate need to project a lifestyle I cannot sustain. This makes me the exact opposite of my older brother, Merrick. At 32 years old, Merrick holds the title of marketing director for a mid-tier lifestyle brand, though if you looked at his curated social media feeds, you would think he was the chief executive officer of a Fortune 500 company. He is the undeniable golden child of our family, the one who always brought home the shiny athletic trophies, the one who commanded every room with a charismatic, blinding smile that my parents adored. Meanwhile, I was always the quiet one sitting in the corner, building my success in the dark, gathering resources while they gathered applause. To truly understand the suffocating dynamic of my family, you have to walk through the museum of pain I have been living in since childhood. Every exhibit in this museum is a testament to their blatant favoritism, but let us examine one specific, defining memory. When I was 22, freshly graduated with honors and landing my first real corporate job, my parents, Thaddeus and Rowena, called a serious family meeting. The atmosphere was thick with tension. Merrick had recently landed a new marketing gig and convinced himself he needed a luxury vehicle to project the right image to his clients. The problem was, his credit score was essentially a burning wreckage due to years of reckless spending. My parents sat me down and demanded I co-sign a massive loan for a brand new BMW for him. They used every manipulation tactic in the book. They told me it was what families do, that I was a man now and needed to sacrifice for my brother's rise to the top. Like an idiot desperately craving a fraction of the approval they showered on Merrick, I signed the papers. For months later, the inevitable happened. Merrick defaulted on the payments. I received the notice in the mail and confronted my parents, panicked that the pristine credit score I had meticulously built was going to be dragged through the mud. My father, Thaddeus, did not even look up from his newspaper. He simply brushed it off, telling me Merrick needed the car for his diplomatic facade, to network with high-end clients. He looked me in the eye and said, "As his brother, you should understand the sacrifices required for real success. Just handle it, Declan." I ended up quietly working 80-hour weeks, taking on extra auditing contracts, paying off his missed installments just to save my own financial future. That was the exact day the remaining warmth in my heart turned to ice. I learned a permanent, undeniable lesson. My success and stability were only valuable to them if they could be harvested to serve Merrick's vanity. From that day forward, I stopped sharing anything about my life. I stopped seeking their approval. I drove my old, reliable sedan, wore plain, unbranded clothes, and poured every single cent I earned into strategic, high-yield investments. The phone call that set this entire current disaster into motion came on a random Tuesday evening. I was sitting at my home office desk, reviewing a complex corporate merger file, when my phone buzzed. Merrick's name flashed on the screen. He called me, his voice booming through the speaker with that signature, unearned condescension. He did not ask how I was doing. He never does. He immediately launched into a breathless monologue about his new living situation. He had just signed a lease on a penthouse in the downtown financial district, boasting loudly that the rent was $5,000 a month. He talked about the floor-to-ceiling windows, the imported marble countertops, and how he had aggressively negotiated some trivial gym amenity into the contract as if he were a master Wall Street dealmaker. Then he dropped the invitation. With a chuckle that made my skin crawl, he told me I needed to come to his housewarming party on Saturday. He said I needed to see how the other half lives, to take a break from my depressing little bunker of an apartment. I stared at the wall, my voice flat and void of any emotion, and agreed to attend. I hung up the phone shortly after his self-congratulatory sign-off. I leaned back in my ergonomic desk chair and looked at my computer monitors. On the screen was my current, highly encrypted personal balance sheet. My net worth was sitting at roughly $2.8 million, a number I had built through ruthless budgeting, smart commercial real estate acquisitions, and aggressive equity investments. But the irony that made me smile a cold, bitter smile was a specific line item on my portfolio. The property management conglomerate that owned and operated Merrick's new luxury building was a company in which my investment fund held a massive, quiet stake. He was literally paying my dividends every single month to inflate his own ego. I decided right then and there that I would attend his little coronation ceremony. It was time to see his kingdom built on sand. Saturday afternoon arrived with a heavy, overcast sky, the gray clouds perfectly matching my internal mood. I stood in front of my walk-in closet, meticulously choosing my armor for the evening. I bypassed the row of tailored Italian suits I wore to high-level corporate board meetings. I ignored the expensive silk ties and the custom leather shoes. Instead, I reached for the back of the rack and grabbed an off-the-rack gray suit that I had bought years ago. I paired it with a plain white button-down shirt and a dull, striped tie that screamed middle management mediocrity. I wanted to look exactly how they expected me to look. I wanted to be the perfect, unremarkable, drab canvas for Merrick's vibrant, desperate vanity. My strategy had always been total invisibility. When you are the designated family scapegoat, any success or happiness you show is either minimized, stolen, or aggressively mocked. Before heading directly to the Lion's Den, I stopped at a quiet, upscale local cafe on the edge of the city to meet the only person in my family who actually saw me as a human being, Aunt Beatrix. She is my mother's older sister, but genetically and morally, they could not be more different. Beatrix is a retired university professor, sharp as a tack, possessing a terrifyingly accurate intuition and a deep intolerance for foolishness. She was already sitting in a secluded corner booth, sipping a black coffee, looking over a thick stack of legal documents I had asked her to review earlier that week. Beatrix is the only family member who knows the truth, or at least a significant portion of it, about my financial reality. Just last week, she had helped me navigate complex municipal zoning laws and sign the final paperwork for my latest, most ambitious acquisition. It was a sprawling, historic estate on the outskirts of the city, featuring endless acres of land and a massive main house, which I had purchased for $2 million in pure cash. I was in the planning stages of renovating it into a boutique corporate retreat center, but right now it remained my quiet, monumental secret project. I slid into the leather booth across from her, ordering a black coffee of my own from the passing waiter. She pushed the manila folder toward me, her sharp eyes narrowing as she took in my drab gray suit and the scuffed dress shoes I had deliberately chosen. She sighed, a sound of genuine, deep-seated frustration. She asked me why I continued to dress like a substitute teacher who had given up on life, especially when she knew what was sitting in my bank accounts. I told her I was going to Merrick's housewarming party and did not want to steal his thunder, keeping my tone intentionally dry. Beatrix shook her head, her silver hair catching the dim light of the cafe. She asked me, her voice filled with genuine concern, why I continued to play this toxic game with them. She could not understand why I let Thaddeus and Rowena treat me like a second-class citizen while they openly worshipped a son who was built entirely on revolving credit card debt and manufactured lies. I looked out the cafe window, watching the city traffic crawl by under the gray sky. I took a sip of the bitter coffee and explained my philosophy to her. I told her that power, real, unshakable power, does not need to shout. Merrick needs to shout. He needs to buy $5,000 penthouses and wear designer labels, because if he stops making noise, everyone will realize there is nothing actually there. I told her I did not want our parents' superficial love, the kind of transactional affection they only dispense when you are standing on a pedestal they approve of. Keeping my wealth hidden gave me ultimate control. It gave me a thick, impenetrable protective shield against their endless demands, their emotional manipulation, and their toxic comparisons. If they thought I had nothing, they could not ask me for anything. Beatrix listened quietly, her fingers drumming a slow rhythm on the wooden table. She validated my anger, acknowledging how deeply unfair and damaging my childhood had been. She told me I had every right to protect myself, and that she was proud of the man I had become despite their neglect. But she also issued a warning. She looked at me seriously and said that a secret that massive is like a highly pressurized tank. You can reinforce the steel all you want, but eventually, if the pressure gets too high, the metal bends and explodes. As we finished our drinks and stood up to leave, the atmosphere shifted. She adjusted her elegant trench coat and looked me dead in the eye. Her expression was a mix of protective fury and grim determination. She said that she would be attending the party tonight as well, invited by Rowena to witness the family triumph. She told me, in no uncertain terms, that if Merrick went too far this time, she was not going to sit there and bite her tongue the way I always did. I gave her a small, tight smile, thinking she was just trying to be supportive, assuming she meant she would offer a polite, passive-aggressive comment to defend me if things got awkward. I severely underestimated her. I had no idea she was preparing to detonate a nuclear bomb in the middle of my brother's living room. The drive from the cafe to the downtown financial district took exactly 35 minutes in the sluggish weekend traffic. The building Merrick had chosen for his grand display of success was a towering, imposing obelisk of dark glass and cold steel, designed specifically to separate fools from their money by selling them an illusion of elite status. I parked my 10-year-old sedan 3 blocks away in a cheap public lot, walking the rest of the distance with a generic, $12 bottle of wine secured in a brown paper bag. The lobby of the building smelled of expensive artificial cedar, floor wax, and desperation. I bypassed the haughty concierge, rode the high-speed, silent elevator to the top floor, and felt my stomach tighten with a familiar dread with every passing floor indicator. When the heavy, polished mahogany door of Penthouse 612 swung open, a blast of loud, chaotic jazz music and the overlapping chatter of 20 people hit me squarely in the face. Merrick stood in the entryway, holding an oversized crystal glass of red wine. He was dressed in a bespoke navy blazer that likely cost more than my first car, paired with designer loafers worn without socks. He looked exactly like the cover model for a magazine dedicated to people who inherit trust funds and pretend they earned them through hard work. Upon seeing me, he threw his arms wide, greeting me with an exaggerated, booming voice. He pulled me into a rough, patronizing hug, making sure to pivot so the entire room could witness his benevolence. He announced to the crowd that his little brother, the number cruncher, had finally crawled out from under his spreadsheets to see how the real world operates. I forced a polite, entirely dead smile and stepped inside the apartment. Through the calculated, unforgiving lens of an auditor, the Penthouse was a fascinating case study in catastrophic financial decisions. The layout was impressive, yes, but the furniture was clearly rented from a high-end staging company. The art on the walls was mass-produced junk trying desperately to look avant-garde, and the wine he was pouring was a mid-tier brand decanted into crystal to look expensive. I navigated through the milling crowd, heading toward the massive kitchen island where my parents had firmly set up camp. Thaddeus and Rowena were holding court, glowing with an almost religious fervor as they talked to anyone who would listen about Merrick's unprecedented success. They were practically vibrating with pride, their eyes shining as they looked around the rented space. When I approached to say hello, my mother gave me a brief, distracted side hug, her eyes immediately darting back to the floor-to-ceiling windows. She asked if I had seen the view yet, not waiting for an answer before launching into how proud she was. Before I could even formulate a neutral reply, Merrick swaggered over. Clinging to his arm was a tall, stunningly polished woman radiating an aura of intense snobbery. This was Sloane, his girlfriend of 6 months. Sloane was an art broker who spoke with an affected, breathy transatlantic accent and looked at people as if she were appraising their resale value at an auction. Merrick introduced me, intentionally emphasizing the word accountant with a slight, mocking drawl that made Cale, who was standing nearby, snicker. Sloane looked me up and down, her eyes lingering with blatant distaste on my off-the-rack gray suit, and offered a tight, dismissive smile. She leaned in slightly and said it must be so incredibly relaxing to have a job where you just sit in a gray cubicle all day and never have to worry about the heavy pressure of real business negotiations. I maintained my composure, gripping the neck of my cheap wine bottle, and offered a neutral, polite reply about the value of financial stability. But Merrick was not satisfied. He wanted a show. He needed to assert his dominance in front of Sloane and her wealthy friends. He started loudly boasting about his new luxury watch, a bulky, diamond-encrusted monstrosity, gesturing wildly with his hand that held the full glass of red wine. As he spun around to show off the timepiece to a guest behind him, his arm swung directly, and I suspect purposefully, into my chest. A massive splash of dark red wine erupted across my crisp white shirt, blooming instantly into a massive, undeniable stain. The conversation in our immediate circle ground to a sudden, awkward halt. I stood perfectly still, the cold liquid seeping through the thin fabric to my skin. Merrick did not drop his glass. He did not look horrified. He did not even offer a genuine apology. Instead, he let out a loud, booming laugh that echoed off the marble countertops. He patted my shoulder, his hand intentionally smearing the wet stain further into the fabric, and told me I should not worry about it because the shirt looked like it came from a discount bin anyway. He actually reached into his tailored pants pocket, pulled out a crumpled $20 bill, and tried to stuff it into my jacket pocket, telling me to go buy myself a new shirt on him. I looked at my parents, standing merely 3 feet away, waiting for them to intervene. I waited for them to tell a 32-year-old man to apologize for treating his younger brother like dirt. Instead, Thaddeus sighed, a sound of profound annoyance directed entirely at me. He told me to go to the bathroom and scrub it out quickly so I would not ruin the aesthetic of the party and embarrass Merrick in front of his important guests. I slowly took the $20 bill from Merrick's hand, placed it meticulously on the marble counter, and turned on my heel without a word. I walked down the long hallway toward the gold-plated guest bathroom, locked the heavy door behind me, and gripped the edges of the porcelain sink. I looked at myself in the mirror, watching the red stains spread over my chest like a bleeding wound. The iron patience I had relied on for nearly 3 decades was severely, irreparably cracking. I spent a grueling 15 minutes in that opulent bathroom, dabbing uselessly at the stain with a thick, monogrammed paper towel. I focused on breathing deeply, counting backward from 100, using every mental exercise I knew to keep my heart rate steady and my anger contained. When I finally emerged back into the hallway, the stain was a faded, ugly pink, but still blatantly obvious across my chest. I walked back into the living room just as Merrick was gathering his disciples for the grand tour of his rented empire. I hung at the back of the group, a silent, stained observer in a gray suit. Merrick led the procession from room to room, his voice echoing loudly off the Brazilian hardwood floors. He pointed out the panoramic views of the city skyline, the automated smart blinds that he controlled with his phone, and the heated tiles in the master bathroom as if he had personally engineered and invented them. He made sure to drop the $5,000 rent figure at least 3 distinct times during the tour. Each time, he paused slightly, letting the number hang in the air to sink in and generate the expected gasps of admiration and envy from the audience. To him, that enormous monthly expense was a badge of supreme honor, a validation of his worth. To me, it was a catastrophic liability on a balance sheet, a giant red flag signaling imminent financial ruin. As the tour moved back toward the main living area, the heavy front door of the penthouse opened, and a man in a sharp, impeccably tailored charcoal suit walked in. It was Bastian, the regional director of operations for the property management company. I knew Bastian extremely well. We had sat in several tense, high-stakes board meetings together over the past year, and he was acutely aware of exactly who I was and how much immense leverage my investment fund held over his regional operating budget. Bastian had apparently stopped by to deliver a complimentary, high-end bottle of champagne to the new tenant, which was standard operating procedure for the occupants of their premium-tier penthouses. Bastian handed the frosted bottle to Merrick, offering polite, polished corporate congratulations. Then, as he turned to leave, Bastian's eyes swept the room and landed directly on me. I saw the distinct micro-expression of profound shock register on his face. He saw the cheap gray suit, the massive, spreading wine stain on my chest, and the fact that I was standing in the back of the room looking like a hired servant waiting for orders. Bastian immediately opened his mouth, taking a half-step toward me to offer a deferential greeting. I caught his eye instantly. I gave a sharp, almost imperceptible shake of my head. My eyes bored into his, communicating a clear, silent command. Do not say a single word. Bastian, a true professional survivor in the corporate world, swallowed his greeting whole, gave me a subtle, tight nod of compliance, and smoothly excused himself from the apartment. Just as the heavy door clicked shut behind Bastian, my cousin Cale sauntered over to me. Cale is what you would clinically call a flying monkey, a weak-willed relative who feeds on the scraps of Merrick's popularity by bullying whoever Merrick currently targets. Cale took a long sip of his imported beer, looked pointedly at my stained shirt, and let out a derisive, wet snort. He leaned against the wall and asked me when I was finally going to move out of my depressing, one-bedroom bunker. He stated loudly that it was frankly embarrassing that an accountant who spends all day counting other people's money could not figure out how to make any decent cash for himself. I looked at Cale. Here was a guy who was currently working his third entry-level sales job in 2 years, drowning in student loans he refused to pay, trying to lecture me on wealth. I felt absolutely nothing but cold, clinical pity for him. I smiled mildly, keeping my voice soft, telling him that I preferred a quiet life with low overhead and manageable stress. Cale laughed loudly, an obnoxious sound that drew the attention of several guests. He slapped my shoulder hard and shouted to the room that Declan was still afraid of his own shadow and hiding from the real world. As I stood there, enduring the barrage of mockery, I glanced back at the front door. I knew Bastian was likely standing in the hallway right now, waiting for the elevator, deeply confused as to why a senior equity partner of the building's management firm was letting a mid-tier, debt-ridden tenant treat him like a disposable jester. The disconnect between the hidden reality and the pathetic illusion playing out in this room was rapidly becoming suffocating. By the time dinner was formally announced, the physical tension in my jaw was giving me a throbbing headache at my temples. The dining area was set up with a massive, imposing glass table that barely fit the space, surrounded by incredibly uncomfortable modern chairs designed for aesthetics rather than human use. The food had been delivered and plated by a high-end catering service, representing yet another massive, unnecessary expense piled onto Merrick's towering mountain of debt. We all moved to take our assigned seats. Thaddeus and Rowena were seated directly to Merrick's right and left, holding the unquestionable places of honor. Sloane sat gracefully beside him, looking distinctly bored and checking her phone every 2 minutes. I found my small name card near the far end of the table, seated between the obnoxious Cale and one of Sloane's pretentious, silent friends. Directly across from me sat Aunt Beatrix, her expression unreadable but her posture rigid. As the catered plates of dry, herb-crusted salmon and overpriced, undercooked asparagus were passed around by hired staff, the conversation flowed freely. It quickly became apparent to my trained ear exactly why Merrick was putting on such an aggressive, desperate display of wealth. Sloane had consumed a few glasses of wine and began talking loudly to her friends about her strict expectations for the future. She casually mentioned a friend's recent destination wedding in Tuscany, dropping heavy hints about diamond clarities, exclusive neighborhood prestige, and the necessity of summer homes. It hit me instantly, like a puzzle snapping together. Merrick was terrified. He was trapped in a financial death spiral, desperately trying to project enough liquid wealth to keep Sloane, a woman clearly out of his financial league, interested. His deep-seated insecurity was a gaping, bleeding wound, and the only way he knew how to soothe the pain of his own inadequacy was by pushing me down so he could feel momentarily taller. The conversation around the long table inevitably turned to careers, which had always been the family's favorite, bluntest weapon against me. Thaddeus boasted loudly about Merrick's recent marketing campaign, claiming with zero evidence that it had single-handedly revolutionized the entire industry. Rowena chimed in, touching Merrick's arm softly, saying how exhausting it must be for him to carry so much creative responsibility and leadership on his shoulders. Then, as if they were following a well-rehearsed, toxic script, Rowena looked down the length of the table directly at me. She tilted her head in that specific condescending way that only mothers can perfect, and asked, with faux concern, if I was still doing data entry at that little boring accounting firm downtown. I corrected her, keeping my voice meticulously even and devoid of anger, stating that I was a senior corporate auditor, not a data entry clerk. Cale snickered loudly into his napkin, muttering that it was basically the exact same thing, just staring at spreadsheets until your eyes bleed while real men make deals. Merrick leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on the glass table, soaking in the collective attention. He told Sloane's friends, loudly enough for everyone to hear, that I had always been the excessively cautious one in the family. He painted a pathetic picture, saying I was the guy who saved his pennies in a ceramic piggy bank while real men went out and conquered the volatile market. He shook his head in mock pity and said I fundamentally lacked the killer instinct required for true financial success. I focused intensely on cutting my piece of dry salmon, refusing to give them the emotional reaction they so desperately wanted. I looked up briefly and caught Aunt Beatrix's eye. She was not eating. She had not touched her food. She was gripping her heavy silver fork so tightly her knuckles were stark white, glaring directly at Thaddeus and Rowena with a potent mixture of profound disgust and utter disbelief. The air in the room felt impossibly thick, heavy with the suffocating, accumulated weight of 3 decades of disrespect. Every bite of the expensive food tasted like dry ash in my mouth. I was a multimillionaire sitting at a rented table, being lectured on the mechanics of success by a man who was mathematically one missed paycheck away from total, unrecoverable bankruptcy. The sheer, staggering audacity of the situation was almost comical, but the intense anger burning in my chest wiped away any trace of humor. Suddenly, the sharp, piercing sound of a silver knife tapping against a crystal wine glass cut through the ambient chatter. It demanded total, immediate silence. Merrick stood up slowly, smoothing the front of his expensive blazer, his face flushed with a dangerous cocktail of alcohol and unearned arrogance. He raised his glass high above his head. The execution I had been dreading all night was about to officially begin. Merrick stood at the head of the glass table, surveying his rented domain and his captive audience like a tin-pot dictator. He began his grand toast by profusely thanking his friends for coming to celebrate his milestone, thanking Sloane for being his beautiful, inspiring muse, and thanking our parents for teaching him the supreme value of relentless, unapologetic ambition. Thaddeus beamed, his chest puffing out as he raised his own glass in a silent, deeply proud salute. Rowena looked up at her eldest son with misty eyes, as if he had just cured a major global disease rather than signed a lease he couldn't afford. Then, Merrick's eyes drifted deliberately down the length of the table, skipping over the wealthy guests, skipping over Cale, until they locked squarely onto me. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet instantly. I recognized the malicious gleam in his eye. It was the exact same look he used to get when we were children, right before he would purposefully break one of my favorite toys and successfully convince our parents that I had broken it myself in a fit of rage. He took a slow, theatrical breath, clearly preparing for his grand finale, the punchline of the entire evening. He gestured vaguely in my direction with his half-full wine glass, a look of deeply insulting faux sympathy plastered across his handsome face. He announced to the hushed room that he wanted to give a very special shout-out to his little brother, Declan. He told the room, his voice dripping with condescension, that he had always tried to push me, to inspire me to break out of my boring, safe little shell and take a real risk in life. He placed a hand over his heart and said it genuinely broke his heart to see me living like a broke, struggling college student, wasting away in a tiny, depressing apartment while the best years of my life passed me by. Then he delivered the killing blow. He smirked, looking around at Sloane and her wealthy friends to ensure they were paying attention, and said loudly, his voice echoing off the glass walls, "I keep telling him to upgrade, to live a little. But you know how it is, folks." He paused for dramatic effect. "Not everyone can afford a $5,000 luxury penthouse." The table erupted on cue. Cale barked out a harsh, cruel laugh, slamming his hand flat on the table in exaggerated amusement. Sloane's friends giggled politely, whispering behind their manicured hands, looking at my stained shirt with blatant pity. But the knife to the heart, the exact moment that finally violently shattered the dam holding back my decades of suppressed rage, was looking at Thaddeus and Rowena. They were smiling. My mother was covering her mouth, her eyes crinkling in genuine, unforced amusement, while my father shook his head with an indulgent, hearty chuckle, completely validating and endorsing the public slaughter of my dignity. Time seemed to slow down to a crawl. The sound of their collective laughter faded into a dull, rushing roar in my ears, like the sound of an approaching train. I sat perfectly, rigidly still, my hands resting flat and cold on the table on either side of my plate. For years, for my entire adult life, I had convinced myself that keeping the peace was the mature, superior choice. I had rationalized their toxic behavior, telling myself they just did not understand my path, that my quiet success was enough for me. But in that singular, crystallized moment, staring at the smug, punchable satisfaction on my brother's face and the complicit, joyful cruelty on my parents' faces, the grand delusion completely evaporated. My silence was not protecting me. My silence was giving them a blank check, explicit permission to trample me whenever they needed an ego boost. They did not misunderstand me. They actively, gleefully enjoyed feeling superior to me. I took a slow, deep breath, the air filling my lungs with a sudden, freezing, terrifying clarity. My pulse, which had been racing all night, suddenly settled into a slow, rhythmic, predatory beat. I was not the scared, people-pleasing younger brother anymore. I was a man who literally held their entire fabricated, debt-ridden world in the palm of my hand. I placed my cloth napkin meticulously on the table, bracing my hands on the arms of my chair. I was going to stand up. I was going to systematically, clinically, and ruthlessly tear his life apart using nothing but the brutal, objective truth. But I never got the chance to speak. Before I could even push my chair back from the table, a violent, screeching sound tore through the dining room, cutting through the laughter like a gunshot. The sharp, horrible noise of wooden chair legs dragging harshly against the expensive hardwood floor made everyone at the table flinch physically. The laughter died instantly, replaced by a stunned, heavy silence. Aunt Beatrix had stood up. She did not just stand. She rose like a tidal wave gathering momentum. Her chair toppled backward, hitting the floor with a loud crack, but she did not even glance at it. Her face, usually so calm, measured, and academic, was twisted into a terrifying mask of absolute, unadulterated fury. She gripped the edge of the glass table with both hands so hard it looked like she might shatter the thick pane with her bare strength. The storm she had warned me about at the cafe hours ago had finally arrived, and looking at the fire in her eyes, I knew it was about to violently level the entire room. Aunt Beatrix Goman ly nuok fa la kwa ba suang mat bon kin. The sharp, piercing clink echoed through the dining room like a gunshot, instantly severing the remaining threads of laughter. The room fell into an abrupt, stunned silence. Every single pair of eyes around that massive, rented table snapped toward her. She stood there, her posture rigid, her chest heaving slightly as she stared down my brother. The indulgent, mocking smiles on my parents' faces vanished, replaced by a sudden, nervous confusion. Merrick blinked, his wine glass halting halfway to his mouth, clearly unsure how to process this sudden interruption to his grand performance. Beatrix did not look at him. Instead, she turned her head slowly, her piercing gaze locking directly onto me. Her expression was a terrifying mix of protective fury and unyielding determination. She took a deep breath, and when she spoke, her voice was not loud, but it carried a chilling resonance that demanded the attention of every soul in that room. "Is that why you bought a $2 million estate, Declan?" she asked, her words dropping like anvils onto the glass table. The phrase, $2 million estate, hung in the air, vibrating with a heavy, undeniable truth. For 3 seconds, nobody breathed. It was a dead, suffocating silence. You could literally hear the distant hum of the city traffic through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I watched the physical reactions ripple across the table in slow motion. Merrick's mouth physically dropped open, his jaw going slack as the arrogant smirk melted off his face. Next to him, my mother, Rowena, let out a tiny, involuntary gasp, her hand trembling so violently that a few drops of her red wine spilled onto the pristine white tablecloth. Thaddeus sat frozen, his eyes darting back and forth between Beatrix and me, trying to compute a mathematical equation that his brain stubbornly refused to accept. Sloane, the polished art broker, slowly lowered her fork, her previously bored expression replaced by a sharp, calculating curiosity. The denial phase arrived precisely on schedule. Cale, desperate to maintain the established social order where he wasn't the biggest loser at the table, let out a forced, high-pitched laugh. He waved his hand dismissively at Beatrix. "Come on, Aunt B, what kind of weird joke is this?" Cale stammered, his eyes darting around the room for validation. "If Declan could afford an estate, I would be the President of the United States. The guy lives in a shoebox and clips grocery coupons." Merrick, recovering from his initial shock, latched onto Cale's lifeline with desperate speed. He set his wine glass down, attempting to regain his footing on his crumbling pedestal. He forced a patronizing chuckle, shaking his head. "Aunt Beatrix, you must be confused," Merrick said, his voice carrying a noticeable tremor despite his attempt at confidence. "Did you mix him up with one of the senior partners at his firm? Or maybe one of his clients? Declan just pushes papers around. He does not buy estates." Beatrix did not even blink. She kept her eyes fixed on me, waiting. She had lit the fuse, but she was leaving it to me to throw the explosive. I looked around the table, taking in the varied expressions of disbelief, mockery, and dawning horror. For 29 years, I had shrunk myself to fit into their narrow, comfortable narrative. I had let them define my worth based on a gray suit and a quiet demeanor. But staring at Merrick's desperate, pleading eyes, begging me to deny it so he could go back to being the king, I felt nothing but a profound, liberating emptiness. I pushed my chair back. It scraped loudly against the hardwood floor, echoing Beatrix's earlier movement. I stood up slowly, reaching up to adjust my dull, striped tie. I rolled my shoulders back, instantly shedding the hunched, defeated posture I had adopted for their benefit. I did not look at the floor. I did not look away. I met my brother's gaze head-on, my eyes cold and unyielding. "She is not confused, Merrick," I said, my voice dropping an octave, carrying the smooth, authoritative weight I usually reserved for hostile corporate audits. "She reviewed the deed and the zoning permits for me last week. I paid $2 million in cash for a historic property on the city outskirts." Merrick's face turned the color of ash. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. "And," I continued, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make them squirm, "that estate is just a side project. It is far from the only asset I own." Rowena placed both hands on the table, leaning forward as if trying to see through an illusion. "Declan, what are you talking about?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "You live in that tiny one-bedroom downtown. You drive that old car. You have always struggled." "I never struggled, Mom," I corrected her gently but firmly. "You assumed I struggled, because if I wasn't flaunting every dollar I made, you assumed I had nothing. I chose to live below my means so I could build real capital instead of building a fragile aesthetic." I gestured toward Merrick, who was now gripping the edge of the table as if the floor was tilting beneath him. I chose to buy equity instead of renting a temporary throne. The silence returned, heavier and more oppressive than before. Sloane leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing as she looked at Merrick, realizing that the man sitting beside her was entirely outclassed by the brother he had spent the entire evening mocking. The dynamic of the room had shifted on its axis, and the gravitational pull was now entirely under my control. The tense silence in the dining room was suddenly broken by the sound of measured, confident footsteps approaching from the hallway. Bastian, the regional director of operations who had discreetly exited earlier, had not actually left the penthouse. He had merely stepped into the expansive foyer to take a private phone call. Hearing the escalating commotion and the raised voices, he had returned, likely assuming a conflict had broken out that required management intervention. He walked into the dining area, his sharp charcoal suit standing in stark contrast to the suddenly disheveled energy of Merrick's guests. Bastian surveyed the scene with the trained, calculating eye of a corporate veteran. He saw Beatrix standing defiantly, Merrick looking like a man facing a firing squad, and me standing tall at the end of the table. The subtle command I had issued him earlier with a shake of my head was no longer applicable. The veil had been lifted. Bastian understood the assignment immediately. He bypassed Merrick entirely, walking straight past the golden child and stopping directly beside my chair. In a room full of people who had treated me like a disposable peasant all night, Bastian executed a slight, incredibly respectful bow. "Mr. Vance," Bastian said, his voice projecting clearly across the silent room. "I apologize for the intrusion. I was under the impression you were here conducting a discreet site inspection of the property. I was not informed you had familial ties to our new tenant." Thaddeus frowned, standing up halfway. "Wait, what do you mean? Site inspection?" Bastian turned slightly toward my father, his professional mask firmly in place, but with a subtle undertone of genuine confusion. "Sir, Mr. Vance is a senior equity partner. 3 months ago, his private investment fund acquired a 40% controlling stake in our property management conglomerate." Bastian gestured gracefully around the room, encompassing the panoramic windows and the expensive fixtures. "Speaking from a purely logistical standpoint, your son, Mr. Merrick Vance, is currently remitting his monthly lease payments directly to Mr. Declan Vance's equity portfolio." A collective gasp echoed around the table. Cale dropped his fork onto his porcelain plate with a loud clatter. Sloane's jaw visibly tightened, her eyes widening as the magnitude of Bastian's statement registered in her mind. She looked at Merrick, who was now sweating profusely, his expensive blazer suddenly looking like a straitjacket. Merrick was not a king living in a castle. He was merely renting a room in my kingdom, paying for my dividends with money he likely did not even possess. Merrick stammered, desperately trying to regain some semblance of authority. "Bastian, you are mistaken. Declan is just a mid-level auditor. He wears cheap suits and drinks budget coffee." Bastian's eyes flicked to Merrick, a profound, icy disdain momentarily breaking through his corporate neutrality. Bastian was a man who appreciated true luxury, not the loud, desperate imitation of it. He looked deliberately at the fading, ugly pink stain spreading across my chest, a visual reminder of Merrick's earlier cruelty. Bastian let out a soft, polished sigh of disapproval. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a pristine silk handkerchief, holding it out to me. "It is truly unfortunate about your shirt, Mr. Vance," Bastian said smoothly, turning his gaze back to Merrick like a predator locking onto wounded prey. "That is a custom, hand-tailored piece from Seville Row, valued at roughly $1,500. It requires a specific silk weave and an artisan's touch. It is a terrible tragedy that you chose to soil it with a bottle of wine that barely costs $20, Mr. Merrick. It shows a severe lack of refinement." I had intentionally worn a cheap shirt that night to blend in, but Bastian was a master of corporate warfare. He knew exactly what he was doing. He was building a myth in real time, elevating me to an untouchable status while simultaneously crushing Merrick's entire aesthetic foundation into dust. I did not correct him. I took the silk handkerchief and dabbed at the stain, playing along with the lethal performance. Merrick looked down at his own drink, the illusion of his high-class lifestyle utterly shattered by a man who actually ran the building he worshipped. Sloane slowly pushed her chair back, creating physical distance between herself and Merrick. Her transatlantic accent dropped entirely when she spoke, replaced by a sharp, furious hiss. "Merrick?" she demanded, her voice trembling with anger. "Is he telling the truth? Do you not own anything here? Are you renting this place from your brother's company?" Merrick could not look at her. He stared at his trembling hands, the heavy diamond-encrusted watch suddenly looking incredibly gaudy and absurd on his wrist. The physical evidence was overwhelming, verified by an independent authority figure that Merrick could not dismiss or bully. The golden child was falling from his pedestal, and there was no one left to catch him. Panic is a fascinating emotion to observe in someone who has spent their entire life believing they are untouchable. The dining room air, previously thick with the smell of roasted salmon and expensive perfume, now reeked of raw, desperate fear. Sloane continued to push, her voice rising in pitch as the reality of her situation set in. She had invested 6 months into a man she believed was a rising corporate titan, only to discover he was a heavily leveraged tenant living in a glass house owned by the brother he mercilessly mocked. "Answer me, Merrick," Sloane snapped, her perfectly manicured hand slamming against the table. "You told me you were buying this unit. You told me you had liquid assets. Have you been lying to me this entire time?" Backed into a corner, with his girlfriend demanding answers, his parents staring in muted horror, and his friends watching his spectacular demise, Merrick defaulted to his oldest, most reliable defense mechanism: attacking me. He shot up from his chair, pointing a trembling finger in my direction. "You set this up," Merrick roared, a desperate, ugly sound. "You planned this whole thing to embarrass me in front of my guests. You are a snake, Declan. You manipulated the management company just to humiliate me because you have always been jealous of me." I looked at him, feeling a profound sense of exhaustion. Even now, facing the undeniable truth, he could not accept responsibility. I slowly reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The truth is much louder than shouting. "I didn't set anything up, Merrick," I said quietly, tapping the screen of my phone. "I merely attended the party you insisted I come to, so you could show me how the other half lives. But since we are demanding transparency, let us talk about your half." I looked at the screen, pulling up a highly secure financial dossier. Because Merrick had foolishly asked me to look over his tax documents the previous year, while actively hiding his massive liabilities, I had a very clear picture of his financial architecture. "You want to talk about jealousy?" I asked, my voice echoing in the silent room. "Let us talk about your current revolving debt. As of this morning, you are carrying roughly $150,000 in unsecured credit card debt, spread across 5 different premium cards. This penthouse lease? You paid the deposit by taking out a high-interest personal loan that you secured using Dad's retirement account as collateral." Thaddeus gasped, his hand flying to his chest as if he had been physically struck. "Merrick, what? My retirement account?" I did not stop. I looked directly at Sloane, who was now pale and shaking. "He cannot afford this lifestyle, Sloane. The watch he is wearing is a replica. The car he drives is leased to its absolute mileage limit. He is mathematically insolvent. Burning through cash, he does not have to maintain an illusion for people he doesn't actually care about." Merrick lunged forward slightly, his face contorted in rage, but Bastian stepped smoothly between us, his presence a solid wall of corporate security. Merrick stopped, breathing heavily, realizing he had absolutely nowhere left to run. The numbers were out in the open, undeniable, unforgiving, and utterly shocking. Sloane did not yell. She did not throw her wine. She executed a much more devastating maneuver. She stood up smoothly, picking up her designer clutch from the table. She looked at Merrick with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust, as if she had just stepped in something foul on the sidewalk. "You are pathetic," Sloane stated, her voice ice cold. "Cancel the trip to Aspen. Lose my number. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the penthouse, the heavy mahogany door clicking shut behind her with a dreadful finality. Several of her friends immediately stood up, muttering awkward excuses, refusing to make eye contact with Merrick as they scurried out after her. Cale sat frozen in his chair, staring at his half-empty beer, suddenly terrified that his association with Merrick was now a massive liability. The illusion was entirely shattered. The golden child had collapsed under the weight of his own lies, and the rubble of his ego was scattered all over the beautiful Brazilian hardwood floor. Please drop a comment with the letter W if you are enjoying this satisfying twist. W stands for win, for everyone who stays until the end. I will heart and reply to every single comment with that keyword. The mass exodus of Sloane and her wealthy entourage left the dining room feeling vast, empty, and incredibly cold. The jazz music continued to play softly from the hidden speakers, a cheerful soundtrack to a devastating family funeral. Merrick collapsed back into his chair, burying his face in his hands, completely broken. I stood there for a moment, absorbing the silence, preparing to leave. But my parents were not finished. The shock had begun to wear off, replaced by a desperate need to reassert control over a narrative that had violently slipped from their grasp. Rowena stood up, her face streaked with ruined makeup, and grabbed my arm. Her grip was surprisingly tight. "We need to talk," she hissed, her voice shaking. "Now." In the kitchen, Thaddeus followed close behind, his face a stormy mask of confusion and misplaced anger. They practically dragged me away from the ruined dining table, pushing through the swinging door into the massive, pristine catering kitchen. The stainless steel appliances gleamed under the harsh overhead lights, creating a sterile environment perfect for an interrogation. As soon as the door swung shut, sealing us off from Merrick and Beatrix, the trial began. "How could you do this?" Rowena demanded, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. "How could you humiliate your brother like that in front of his friends and his girlfriend? You destroyed his life tonight, Declan." I leaned casually against the cold marble counter, crossing my arms over my stained shirt. I looked at the two people who were supposed to protect me, who were now fiercely defending the man who had tormented me for hours. "I didn't destroy anything," I replied, my tone clinical and detached. "I simply provided the accounting. Merrick built a house of cards. I just opened a window and let the breeze in." "You hid this from us," Thaddeus boomed, stepping forward, trying to use his physical presence to intimidate me the way he did when I was a teenager. "You lied to your own family. You sat there for years letting us worry about you, letting us think you were barely scraping by while you were sitting on millions. We are your parents. You were supposed to share your successes with us." I let out a harsh, humorless laugh that echoed off the metal cabinets. The sheer hypocrisy was breathtaking. I pushed myself off the counter and stepped toward them, refusing to give up an inch of ground. "Share my successes with you?" I asked, my voice dangerously low, stripped of any remaining familial warmth. "Let us review the historical data, shall we? When I was 25, I became the youngest senior audit manager in the history of my firm. I called you both, incredibly proud to tell you the news. Do you remember what happened?" They both blinked, momentarily derailed by the specific question. They exchanged a blank look. They didn't remember. "I didn't think so," I said, a bitter taste rising in my mouth. "You put me on speakerphone, listened for exactly 30 seconds, and then Thaddeus cut me off because Merrick had just managed to buy VIP tickets to a football championship game, and you needed to discuss his travel arrangements. You hung up on me to talk about a football game." Rowena's eyes widened, a flicker of genuine guilt finally piercing her defensive armor. "Declan, honey, we didn't mean to." "Yes, you did," I interrupted, my voice remaining unervingly calm. "You made a choice. Every single day of my life you made a choice. You nurtured his vanity and you starved my ambition. You allowed him to mock my career, my home, and my lifestyle because it made him feel better about his own failures. I didn't hide my success from you because I am malicious. I hid it because I knew you would either find a way to minimize it or worse, you would demand I use it to bail him out of his self-inflicted disasters." I pointed a finger toward the swinging door. You want a son to be proud of? You have him. You enabled his delusions. You co-signed his arrogance. You are the architects of the man sitting out there crying into his empty wine glass. Just because you chose the wrong person to place the crown on does not mean you get to demand access to the kingdom I built with my own bare hands. Thaddeus opened his mouth, his face turning a deep, angry red, but he had no counter-argument. The objective facts were laid out on the table, and even he could not dispute them. I looked at my mother's tears, feeling a profound, heavy sadness, but not an ounce of regret. I turned around, pushed open the heavy kitchen door, and walked out, leaving them alone in the sterile silence of their own devastating failure. When I stepped back into the dining room, the atmosphere was thick with a heavy, awkward resignation. Cale was gone, having slipped out the front door like a ghost to avoid any collateral damage. Merrick was still slumped in his chair, staring blankly at the wall, a hollow shell of the vibrant, arrogant host he had been an hour ago. Aunt Beatrix was waiting for me near the entryway, her coat already draped over her arm. She gave me a single, firm nod of approval. We walked out of the penthouse together, stepping into the quiet, descending elevator without saying a word to my brother. The ride down to the lobby felt incredibly long, but as the doors opened to the cool night air of the city, I felt a massive, suffocating weight lift off my chest. The secret was out. The war was over. But the aftermath of a war requires treaties and hard boundaries. 3 days after the disastrous housewarming party, my phone buzzed. It was Rowena, asking if they could come see me. I did not invite them to my downtown apartment. Instead, I sent them a GPS pin drop and told them to meet me there at noon. When their conservative sedan pulled up to the massive, wrought iron gates of my newly acquired estate, I was standing on the gravel driveway, reviewing blueprints with a lead contractor. Thaddeus and Rowena stepped out of their car, their eyes wide, taking in the sweeping lawns, the ancient oak trees, and the imposing historic stone facade of the main house. The sheer scale of the property was impossible to ignore or minimize. This was not a rented penthouse. This was a fortress of generational wealth. They approached me slowly, looking incredibly small and out of place against the backdrop of the massive estate. Rowena's eyes were rimmed with red, indicating she had spent the last 3 days doing a lot of crying. Thaddeus looked older, his shoulders slumped, the usual booming confidence entirely drained from his posture. Declan, my father started, his voice rough and hesitant. This place, it is magnificent. We had no idea. I know, I replied, rolling up the blueprints and handing them to my contractor, who discreetly walked away. That was the point. Rowena stepped forward, twisting the strap of her purse nervously. We came to apologize, Declan. Properly. We spent the last few days really talking about the past, about how we treated you. You were right in the kitchen. We were so blinded by Merrick's charm that we ignored your substance. We failed you terribly, and we are so profoundly sorry. I looked at them. The apology felt genuine. It lacked the usual defensive caveats they normally employed. However, an apology does not erase decades of behavioral patterns. I appreciate the apology, I said, my tone remaining polite but firm, establishing the new dynamic. And I forgive you. Carrying anger is a bad investment of my energy. But we need to be incredibly clear about how things are going to work moving forward. I stepped closer to them, making sure they heard every single word. I am not Merrick. I do not need your praise to function, and I do not need your validation to feel successful. More importantly, I am not the family ATM. I know Merrick's financial situation is a ticking time bomb. I know he is facing eviction and bankruptcy. But if you come to me asking for a loan to save him, or if you ask me to give him a job here to preserve his ego, this relationship is permanently severed. My money is a boundary you will not cross. He has to fall and he has to hit the bottom or he will never learn. Thaddeus swallowed hard, looking down at the gravel. He knew I was holding all the cards. He knew that the balance of power had violently and irreversibly shifted. He nodded slowly, a gesture of absolute surrender. "We understand, Declan. We will not ask you for anything. We just want our son back." "You have me?" I said quietly, looking at the massive stone house behind me. "But from now on, we interact on my terms." Later that same evening, as I sat in the quiet solitude of my downtown apartment, watching the city lights flicker through the windows, my phone vibrated on the coffee table. The screen lit up with a text message from a number I rarely interacted with. It was Merrick. The message was long, a rambling, desperate block of text. It lacked all the usual arrogance and condescension. He admitted that Sloane had officially left him, changing the locks on her own apartment. He confessed that Bastion's management company had served him with an eviction warning because he had missed his first official rent payment, having blown the money on the caterer and the luxury watch. He ended the message with a plea that bordered on begging. He asked if I could call Bastion, pull some strings, and give him a 6-month grace period to get his life together. He promised he would pay me back with interest. I stared at the glowing screen for a long time. Part of me, the deeply ingrained, conditioned younger brother, felt a twinge of guilt. It is a terrible thing to watch your own flesh and blood drown, even if they spent years holding your head under the water. But the auditor inside me, the man who dealt in cold realities, knew exactly what would happen if I threw him a life preserver. If I saved him now, he would learn nothing. He would view it as a momentary setback, a temporary inconvenience, and he would immediately return to his destructive, narcissistic patterns, secure in the knowledge that his rich little brother would always be there to clean up his messes. I typed out a brief, decisive reply. "I cannot help you, Merrick. You need to face the consequences of the life you chose to build. Pack your things, break the lease, and move back home with Mom and Dad. It is time to start over. Do not contact me for money again." I hit send, placed the phone face down on the table, and let out a long, slow exhale. It felt incredibly ruthless, but it also felt entirely necessary. True success, I had finally realized, is not just about the numbers in a bank account or the square footage of a historic estate. True success is the ability to fiercely protect your peace, to walk away from toxic systems, and to have the immense courage to let the people who hurt you face the brutal reality of their own actions. Merrick had to face the ultimate humiliation. He had to pack his imitation designer clothes in cardboard boxes, hand the keys of the $5,000 penthouse back to a man who reported to me, and move back into his childhood bedroom under the roof of the parents who had ruined him. It was a spectacular, devastating collapse, and I did not lift a single finger to stop it. I chose to prioritize my own financial and emotional security over the fragile, manufactured ego of the golden child. I leaned back on my couch, the silence of my modest apartment feeling more luxurious than any penthouse ever could. I had won the war by refusing to fight on their battlefield. I built my empire in the shadows, and when they finally dragged me into the light, it was their own illusions that burned to the ground. So, I have to ask you all a question. Merrick is currently sleeping on a twin bed in our parents' house, drowning in debt, and my parents are furious with me for being so rigid and refusing to use my wealth to save my own brother from public ruin. They say family should always rescue family, regardless of the past. But what do you think? Am I a rational, logical brother who is teaching him a necessary, tough lesson? Or am I truly a cold-blooded villain for having the absolute power to save my family and choosing to watch them fall instead? Thank you so much for listening to my story. If you have not subscribed yet, please hit that subscribe button and leave a like on this video to support the channel. We bring you the most intense, real-life family dramas every single week. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let me know how you would have handled this situation. I will see you in the next video.